Some secrets don't stay buried. They wait for something that remembers where they lie. The first night Ethan Caldwell spent on the orchard, he didn't sleep much. Not because of the wind rattling the loose boards of the old farmhouse or the distant hum of trucks along the highway miles away, but because of the sound that didn't belong there at all. A dull, rhythmic thud that cut through the quiet like a heartbeat beneath the soil, steady and relentless. And when he finally pushed himself out of bed, pulling on his worn boots and grabbing the lantern by the door, the air outside greeted him with a dry chill that carried the faint scent of dust and forgotten harvests. The orchard stretching before him in rows of twisted trees that hadn't borne fruit in years, their branches skeletal against a sky washed pale with moonlight. And there, in the far corner where the land dipped slightly, he saw the movement, slow at first, then sharper, a figure shifting against the earth, the old horse, Dusty, the one that had come with the property like an afterthought no one bothered to mention, its coat a faded brown dulled by time, its frame lean but stubbornly upright, and its front hooves striking the ground again and again with a force that seemed far too deliberate for an animal its age, dirt scattering with each motion, the sound carrying across the silent rows of dead trees as if the land itself were answering back. Ethan stopped a few yards away, the lantern light flickering across Dusty's flank, catching the tension in its muscles, the way its ears were pinned forward, focused, as if the rest of the world had ceased to exist. And for a moment he just stood there, watching, trying to make sense of it, because horses didn't do this. Not like this. Not with that kind of persistence. Not with that quiet urgency that felt less like instinct and more like intention. "Hey," he called softly, his voice low, careful not to startle, but Dusty didn't react. Didn't even flick an ear toward him. It just kept digging, hooves breaking the hardened soil that had resisted years of drought and neglect. And something about that unsettled him more than if the horse had bolted or panicked. Because this wasn't fear, it wasn't hunger, it was something else entirely, something Ethan couldn't name yet, but felt settle in his chest like a weight he hadn't expected to carry. He stepped closer, boots crunching lightly over dry ground. And that's when he noticed the marks, shallow grooves carved into the dirt where Dusty had already been, not just tonight, but before, the same spot worn down, disturbed. As if this had been happening for days, maybe longer, and the realization made him pause, his grip tightening slightly on the lantern handle, because that meant this wasn't random. It wasn't a single restless night. It was a pattern, a purpose, and when Dusty finally stopped, just for a breath, lifting its head slightly, its sides rising and falling in a slow, steady rhythm, Ethan caught a glimpse of its eyes in the lantern light, dark, reflective, and fixed not on him, but on the ground beneath its hooves, as if whatever it was searching for, or guarding, lay just inches below the surface, waiting, and in that moment, standing alone in a dead orchard he didn't want, with a horse no one else had cared enough to take. Ethan felt something shift, subtle but undeniable, like the land itself had exhaled after years of silence. And without fully understanding why, he set the lantern down beside him, stepped closer to the disturbed patch of earth, and knelt, his fingers brushing against the loosened soil, still warm from the effort of the horse. And somewhere in the distance, the wind moved through the broken branches with a low whisper, carrying a feeling he hadn't felt in a long time. Not hope exactly, but something close enough to make him stay. The metal did not come free easily, not because it was buried deep, but because time had settled around it like a quiet claim, and Ethan Caldwell found himself slowing down without meaning to, his fingers working carefully along the edge as if the wrong movement might disturb more than just the dirt, the lantern casting a low amber glow over the shallow pit, while the rest of the orchard remained swallowed in darkness. And when he finally loosened enough soil to grip it properly, he pulled, steady and controlled, until the object shifted with a faint scrape and came loose into his hands, smaller than he expected, heavier than it should have been, its surface dulled by years underground, but still holding the unmistakable weight of something made with purpose, not discarded, not forgotten. And for a moment he simply held it there, turning it slightly, brushing away the remaining dirt with his thumb until a faint outline began to emerge. Not words exactly, not yet, but markings, straight lines, edges too precise to be natural, the kind of detail that suggested intention rather than accident. And behind him, Dusty shifted again, stepping closer, the sound of its hoof pressing into the softened ground breaking the silence just enough to pull Ethan's attention back. He glanced over his shoulder and met the horse's gaze. And there was something in it now that had not been there before. Not urgency, not tension, but recognition. As if this moment had been waiting to happen long before either of them understood why. Ethan exhaled slowly, the air cool against his face, and looked back down at the object in his hand, his mind moving through possibilities, old irrigation parts, survey markers, something tied to the land's past use. But none of those explanations felt complete, not with the way the orchard seemed to hold its breath around him, not with the way Dusty had refused to leave this exact spot night after night. He reached down again, setting the metal piece carefully beside the hole, and began clearing more dirt away, widening the space inch by inch, his movements more deliberate now, guided by a growing sense that this was not a single object but part of something larger, something layered beneath the surface in a way that had been hidden not just by time, but by silence, the kind of silence that comes when no one is left who remembers what was placed there. And as he worked, the soil continued to give more easily than it should have, breaking apart in uneven clumps that revealed faint impressions beneath, straight edges, corners, the suggestion of structure rather than debris. And that was when he paused again, his hand hovering over the newly exposed ground, because what he was uncovering no longer looked like a tool or a scrap. It looked like the edge of something contained, something deliberate, a boundary rather than a fragment. And the realization settled into him slowly, like the first drop of rain after a long drought. Subtle, but impossible to ignore. He leaned back slightly, his gaze lifting across the orchard once more, seeing it differently now, not just as rows of dying trees and wasted land, but as a place that had been holding on to something, quietly, patiently, waiting for someone willing to see beyond what was obvious. And in that moment, the memory of the bank office returned. The man's voice explaining numbers and losses and deadlines. The assumption that this land had already given everything it ever would. And Ethan felt a quiet resistance rise in him. Not loud, not defiant, but steady. The kind that does not need to prove itself to anyone else, only to remain. He looked back down at the hole, at the edges beginning to take shape under his hands, and then at Dusty, who stood beside him without moving, without needing to. And for the first time since he had stepped onto this property, Ethan did not feel like he was standing on something broken. He felt like he was standing at the edge of a question that had not yet been fully asked, and somewhere deep beneath the surface, whatever answer waited there had already begun to change everything. By the time the first light of morning stretched across the orchard, Ethan Caldwell had not gone back inside. The lantern long burned out beside him, and replaced by a pale gray dawn that revealed just how much of the ground he had disturbed. The hole no longer a shallow patch, but a widening shape that cut through the dry soil with edges too straight to be natural. And for a moment, standing there with dirt on his hands and dust on his boots, he felt the weight of what he had started pressing quietly against his chest, not as fear, but as awareness, because this was no longer a question of curiosity. It was something real now, something that had taken form beneath his hands and refused to be dismissed as coincidence. He crouched again, brushing loose soil away from the edges, revealing more of the structure hidden beneath, the surface smooth in places, angled in others, like part of a container or a panel set deliberately into the ground. And the piece of metal he had pulled free the night before now made more sense. Not a random object, but a fragment of something larger, something that had once been whole. He ran his fingers along the exposed edge and felt a faint seam, a line that suggested an opening, though whatever it had once been designed to do had been sealed by time. The dirt packed tightly around it, as if the earth itself had chosen to keep it hidden. Behind him, Dusty stood where he always had, quiet, steady, the early light catching along the curve of his back. And when Ethan glanced over, he noticed the horse was no longer digging, no longer restless. It simply watched, as if its part in this had shifted from action to witness. And that change settled into Ethan more deeply than anything else, because it meant the digging had never been the end. It had been the beginning, a signal, a way of pointing him to this exact place at this exact moment. And now the choice belonged to him alone. He stood slowly, stretching the stiffness from his back, his gaze drifting beyond the orchard toward the distant road where a thin line of dust marked a passing truck. The world moving on as if nothing here had changed, and yet everything felt different. The land beneath his feet no longer empty, no longer worthless in the quiet way people had assumed, but holding something that had survived unnoticed for years, maybe decades, waiting without urgency, without demand, just waiting. Ethan wiped his hands again and stepped back from the hole, taking in the shape of it from a distance, trying to see it not as a discovery, but as a problem to solve, because that was how he had learned to survive, not by chasing hope, but by understanding what stood in front of him. And what stood in front of him now was not just buried metal. It was a structure, a hidden piece of something that did not belong to a failed orchard, and the question of how it had gotten there pressed at the edges of his thoughts. Who had placed it? Why it had been covered? Why no one had ever spoken of it? And as those questions formed, another followed close behind, quieter but heavier. Who else might already know? The idea did not come from fear, but from instinct. The same instinct that had kept him cautious in a world where nothing valuable stayed unnoticed forever. He turned back toward the farmhouse, its weathered frames standing against the morning light. And for a moment, he considered walking away from it all, calling the bank, taking the offer, letting someone else deal with whatever lay beneath the orchard. But the thought did not hold. It slipped away as quickly as it came, because something had already changed in him, something subtle but firm. The same quiet resistance that had kept him digging through the night now settled into something steadier, something that did not need to be proven. He looked back once more at the exposed edge in the ground, then at Dusty, who remained still, calm, as if the urgency had passed, and only patience remained. And Ethan understood then, not fully, not completely, but enough. Whatever this was, it had not been waiting for just anyone. It had been waiting for someone who would stay. The sun had risen fully by the time Ethan Caldwell returned from the farmhouse with a shovel and a canteen, the light now sharp enough to strip away the mystery of the night, yet somehow leaving the deeper questions untouched, the orchard stretching quiet and still around him, its lifeless trees casting long, thin shadows that seemed to point toward the place where the ground had been opened. And as he walked back to it, the weight of the shovel in his hand felt different than it had the day before, no longer just a tool for clearing land, but something closer to a decision, something that carried consequence with every inch of dirt it moved. He paused at the edge of the hole, looking down at the exposed surface beneath. The faint seemed more visible now in the morning light, and for a moment he hesitated, not because he doubted what he had seen, but because he understood that whatever lay beneath would not go back to being unknown once he uncovered it. And that kind of knowledge had a way of changing things, whether you wanted it to or not. Dusty stood a few feet away, no longer digging, no longer urging, just watching with a quiet patience that felt almost deliberate, as if the horse had already done everything it needed to do and now the rest belonged entirely to him. Ethan exhaled slowly and drove the shovel into the soil beside the exposed edge, the blade cutting cleanly through the loosened dirt, each movement controlled, measured, as he worked around the perimeter instead of directly over it, widening the space carefully rather than rushing toward the center, because something in him resisted the idea of forcing this open. The same instinct that had kept him cautious in other parts of his life now guiding his hands here. The ground continued to give way more easily than it should have, revealing more of the hidden structure inch by inch, until the outline became clearer, not large, perhaps 3 feet across at most, rectangular in shape, its surface smooth except for the faint line running along one side. And when he finally cleared enough space to see it fully, Ethan stepped back again, the shovel resting loosely in his grip as he studied it, the simplicity of it almost more unsettling than anything complex would have been, because it suggested intention without explanation, purpose without context. And that was when he noticed something else, something small but impossible to ignore, a marking along the edge, faint, worn, but there, a set of characters pressed into the metal, not random scratches, not damage, but a deliberate imprint. He crouched again, leaning closer, brushing away the remaining dirt until the marking became clearer, letters and numbers, partially faded but still readable enough to suggest meaning, not something made for farming, not something ordinary. And as he stared at it, trying to piece together what it might represent, a sound drifted across the orchard, low at first, then more distinct, the distant hum of an engine slowing along the road beyond the fence line. Ethan straightened slightly, his gaze lifting toward the edge of the property where a thin line of dust had begun to rise. And though he could not yet see the vehicle itself, the sound alone was enough to shift something inside him. Not fear, but awareness, the quiet understanding that whatever he had uncovered might not remain unseen for long. He looked back down at the structure, then at the metal piece he had pulled free earlier, then at Dusty, who had turned its head slightly toward the road, ears angled just enough to catch the sound. And in that small, shared moment, Ethan realized that this was no longer just about what lay beneath the orchard. It was about who else might come looking for it. And the thought settled into him not as panic, but as a steady, grounding clarity. He tightened his grip on the shovel, not in defense, not in resistance, but in resolve, because whatever this was, whatever it turned out to be, he was no longer standing at the edge of someone else's mistake. He was standing in the middle of something that had chosen to reveal itself, and that meant one thing above all else. Walking away was no longer an option. The sound of the engine did not pass by like most did. It slowed, then steadied, then settled into a low idle just beyond the line of dry fence posts that marked the edge of the property. And Ethan Caldwell did not need to see it to know it had stopped. The air itself seemed to hold that information, carrying the faint vibration across the orchard in a way that made the moment feel narrower, more focused, as if the world had quietly reduced itself to this single stretch of land, and whatever was happening on it. He did not move right away, his eyes still fixed on the partially uncovered structure at his feet, the faint marking along its edge catching the morning light just enough to remind him that this was real, that whatever had been buried here was not meant to be found easily, and certainly not by accident. But the presence beyond the fence changed the weight of that realization, turned it from something quiet and personal into something shared, whether he wanted it to be or not. He set the shovel down slowly, not out of hesitation but out of control, choosing stillness over reaction, and then he turned, his gaze lifting across the orchard toward the road, where the dust had begun to settle back into the ground, revealing the outline of a dark truck parked just far enough away to suggest caution rather than coincidence, the kind of distance that allowed someone to observe without committing to being seen. Ethan narrowed his eyes slightly, not in suspicion, but in recognition, because he had seen this before in other forms, in different places, people who watched first and spoke later, people who preferred to understand what they were dealing with before stepping into it. And as he stood there, the quiet between him and that unseen presence stretched thin but unbroken, Dusty shifted beside him, turning fully now toward the fence line, ears forward, body still, not tense but aware. The same awareness that had guided the horse to this spot in the first place now extending outward, as if whatever had drawn it here was not limited to what lay beneath the ground. Ethan exhaled slowly, the breath steady, measured, and then he began to walk, not toward the road, not yet, but along the edge of the orchard, angling his path so that he remained within view without fully approaching, a choice that felt instinctive rather than planned, each step deliberate, boots pressing into the dry soil with a quiet certainty that matched the rhythm of his thoughts. He was not thinking about confrontation, not about questions or answers, but about control, about keeping this moment from slipping into something he could not manage. And when he reached a point where the truck was fully visible through the break in the fence, he stopped, standing just inside his own land. The boundary clear even without words, the vehicle sat there, engine running, windows reflecting the brightening sky, revealing nothing of who might be inside. And for a few seconds nothing happened. No door opened, no voice called out. Just the low hum of the engine and the faint rustle of wind through the orchard behind him. And then, slowly, the driver's side door cracked open, not wide, not abrupt, just enough to suggest intention. And in that small movement Ethan felt the situation shift again, not into danger, not into urgency, but into something more defined, something that would require him to choose how to stand, how to respond, how much to reveal. And behind him, just out of sight but not out of presence, the partially uncovered structure remained where it was, silent, unchanged, holding its place beneath the ground as if it had all the time in the world, while above it, everything else had begun to move. The door did not open all the way, not at first, just enough for a man to step out slowly, his boots meeting the dirt road with a measured kind of confidence that suggested he had no intention of rushing anything. And Ethan Caldwell remained where he was, inside the boundary of the orchard, watching without moving, his posture relaxed but grounded, the space between them holding a quiet tension that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with understanding, because this was no longer about chance. The truck had not stopped here by accident, and the man who now leaned one hand against the open door, scanning the orchard with a calm, practiced gaze, was not here to ask for directions or pass the time. He was here because he already knew something, maybe not everything, but enough to make the drive, enough to wait instead of leaving, and that alone told Ethan more than any introduction could have. The man took a few steps forward, not crossing the fence line, not yet, but closing the distance just enough to make his presence clear, his clothes neat in a way that stood out against the rough edges of the land, his movements controlled, deliberate, like someone used to stepping into places that did not belong to him and making them feel like they might. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried easily across the open ground, steady and even, without urgency or pressure. "Morning," he said, the words simple, almost casual, but placed carefully, like the first move. In a conversation that had already been planned, Ethan nodded once in response, not returning the greeting with anything more than that, because he understood the rhythm here, understood that silence could say as much as words if you let it, and for a few seconds that was all there was, the wind moving lightly through the dead branches, the faint hum of the truck idling behind the man, and the space between them holding steady. Then the man's gaze shifted, just slightly, not directly toward the hole in the orchard, but close enough to suggest awareness, like someone who knew where to look without making it obvious. And that small detail settled into Ethan with a clarity that removed any remaining doubt. This was not curiosity. This was interest, calculated and patient. "Heard this place changed hands," the man continued, his tone still neutral, almost conversational. "Figured I would. Come take a look before things start moving too fast around here." The words were simple, but the meaning behind them carried weight. Not a question, not quite a statement, something in between, and Ethan let them sit there for a moment before responding, his voice calm, unhurried. "Not much to see," he said, the truth layered in a way that could be taken at face value or not, depending on who was listening. The man smiled faintly at that, not dismissive, not amused, just acknowledging the shape of the reply, and then his eyes moved again, this time lingering a fraction longer toward the orchard's center, toward the place where the ground had been disturbed, and though he did not step forward, did not cross the line that separated road from land, the intention was clear enough. He knew, maybe not exactly what, but enough to stay, enough to wait, enough to test the edges of what Ethan would allow. Behind him, Dusty remained still, watching the quiet presence of the horse, grounding the moment in a way that felt steady and unchanged, and Ethan felt that steadiness settle into himself as well, not as resistance, not as defiance, but as something simpler and stronger, a decision forming without needing to be spoken, because whatever this man had come for, whatever he thought he might find here, it was no longer something lying unclaimed beneath the ground. It was something that had been seen, touched, understood, and that changed the terms of everything. Ethan shifted his weight slightly, just enough to make his stance clear without stepping forward or back, and in that small movement, the balance between them adjusted, not broken, not resolved, but defined, and for the first time since the truck had stopped on the road, the quiet felt different, less uncertain, more deliberate, like the beginning of something that would not be settled quickly, no matter how long either of them chose to stand there. The man did not move any closer, but he did not leave either, and that alone stretched the moment into something heavier than a simple exchange between strangers, the kind of silence that carried intention beneath it. And Ethan Caldwell felt that weight settle into place with a quiet certainty, because whatever stood between them now was no longer about introductions or polite curiosity. It was about knowledge, about how much each of them understood and how much they were willing to reveal. The wind shifted slightly across the orchard, carrying with it the dry scent of soil and something else, something faintly metallic from the disturbed ground behind him. And though the man by the truck did not turn his head, did not step forward, there was a subtle change in his posture, a slight narrowing of attention that suggested he had noticed it too. "You planning to sell?" the man asked after a moment, his voice steady, measured. But this time the question carried more than casual interest. It carried direction, as if the answer mattered in a way that extended beyond simple conversation. Ethan let the words settle before responding, his gaze drifting briefly across the orchard before returning to the man. "Not today," he said, and the simplicity of it seemed to shift something again, not dramatically, not in a way that broke the calm, but enough to draw a faint line where there had been none before. The man nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging the answer rather than challenging it, but his eyes moved again, this time more directly, settling toward the center of the orchard with a focus that no longer tried to hide itself. And for a brief second, the quiet between them sharpened, became something clearer, something closer to truth than either of them had spoken aloud. "Interesting place," the man added, almost thoughtfully. "Ground like this does not usually sit empty without a reason." And there it was, not a claim, not an accusation, but a suggestion placed carefully into the space between them, one that did not need to be explained to carry meaning. Ethan felt it land, felt the implication settle in alongside everything else, and instead of answering directly, he turned his head slightly, glancing back toward the place where the ground had been opened, where the edge of something hidden now rested just beneath the surface. And in that brief look, something shifted inside him. Not doubt, not hesitation, but clarity, because for the first time he understood the full shape of what he had uncovered. Not just an object, not just a hidden structure, but something that had value beyond the land itself, something that drew attention, something that others had been waiting for in their own way. And when he looked back at the man, his expression remained calm, unchanged, but his stance carried something new, something grounded and certain. "Maybe it was just waiting," he said quietly, and the words hung there, simple but complete. The man studied him for a moment longer, the faintest hint of a smile touching his expression, not dismissive, not amused, but recognizing, as if he had heard something in that answer that confirmed more than it revealed. He straightened slightly then, stepping back toward the truck without turning his back fully, maintaining that careful awareness that had defined every movement since he arrived. "Things tend to move fast once they get noticed," he said, almost as a final observation. And though the words carried no threat, no pressure, they lingered in the air with a quiet weight, a reminder more than a warning. And then he reached for the door, pausing just long enough to glance once more toward the orchard, toward the place that had already begun to change everything, before climbing back inside, the engine shifting from idle to motion as the truck turned slowly on the road, dust rising again in a thin cloud that followed it away. And as the sound faded into the distance, the orchard settled back into silence. But it was not the same silence as before. It carried something new now, something aware, something awake, and Ethan stood there for a moment longer, watching the road, until it emptied completely, before turning back toward the center of the land, where the ground still waited, where the truth beneath it had not changed, only the world around it had. The dust from the departing truck settled slowly back onto the road, the faint trace of its presence fading into the stillness of the morning, and Ethan Caldwell remained where he stood until the sound of the engine disappeared completely, not because he expected it to return, but because something in him needed to mark the moment, to recognize that whatever had just passed through the edge of his land had not been sleutry or simple curiosity. It had been the first ripple of something larger, something that would not stay distant for long. And when he finally turned back toward the orchard, the quiet that greeted him felt different than it had the day before, no longer empty, no longer overlooked, but aware in a way that settled into his chest with a steady weight. He walked back across the dry ground, each step measured but unhurried, his eyes drawn again to the place where the earth had been opened, where the shape beneath the surface had already begun to define itself as something more than forgotten debris. Dusty followed a few steps behind, not leading now, not urging, simply present, the same quiet presence that had guided everything from the beginning. And when Ethan reached the edge of the hole, he paused, looking down at the partially exposed structure, the faint markings still visible along its edge, the seam that hinted at something contained within, something that had remained untouched for years, maybe longer, and for a moment he did not move, did not reach for the shovel or the soil. He simply stood there, letting the weight of it settle fully, because this was no longer just a discovery. It was a choice, a line that had already been crossed the moment he decided to keep digging. And now there was no returning to what this land had been before, no going back to seeing it as empty or worthless, because something beneath it had already proven otherwise. He knelt again slowly, his hand brushing over the exposed edge, tracing the line where the surface met the soil, and this time when he reached for the seam, he did not hesitate, his fingers pressing against it with a quiet firmness, testing it, feeling for any movement, any give, and for a second nothing happened, the structure holding its place as it had for years. But then, almost imperceptibly, there was a shift, a faint release as if whatever had sealed it had weakened over time, and Ethan leaned closer, steadying himself as he applied a little more pressure, careful, controlled, until the edge lifted. Just enough to reveal darkness beneath, not empty space, not hollow ground, but something contained, something deliberate, and as the opening widened slightly, the morning light slipped inside, catching against a surface below that reflected it back in a muted, metallic glint, not bright, not obvious, but unmistakable, rows of something structured, aligned, not random, not natural. And in that moment the full realization settled into him, not all at once, not as a sudden shock, but as a steady unfolding of truth. Whatever had been buried here was not small, not forgotten. It was valuable in a way that extended far beyond the land itself, something placed with intention, something meant to be hidden until the right moment. And he understood then why the man had come, why the truck had stopped, why the silence around this place had never truly been empty. It had been waiting, and behind him, Dusty let out a quiet breath. The sound soft but certain, and Ethan did not turn, did not need to, because he already knew. This had never been about chance, never been about luck. It had been about timing, about patience, about something guiding him to this exact place at this exact moment. And as he slowly lowered the edge back into place, covering the opening just enough to conceal what lay beneath, his decision settled into him with a calm clarity that did not need to be spoken. He would not sell. He would not walk away. Not now, not after this, because some things were not meant to be handed over the moment they were found. Some things required time, understanding, and the kind of quiet resolve that could not be shaken by offers or pressure. He stood then, brushing the dirt from his hands, his gaze lifting across the orchard once more, and for the first time the land did not look broken to him. It looked unfinished, like something waiting to be brought back to life. And beside him, the old horse stood still in the morning light, no longer digging, no longer searching, just watching, as if it had known all along that the moment would come, and that when it did, everything would change without a single word being said.